In a previous video I did, it was about one of my pet peeves, which is conflicting information, especially as that relates to the health and fitness profession. It drives me crazy when you have different experts that are contradicting one another or flip-flopping on a topic or their opinion on something over time. So I want to do a little extension of that today. I want to talk about some instances when the experts got it wrong. We can look at some obvious ones, things like people used to believe that the earth was flat. They used to believe that the sun revolved around the earth. Obviously that was proven. It took a lot of time, a lot of opposition to those ideas for others to accept that as to be the norm. Now, some examples from history that have to do with health and fitness. One of those is bloodletting. The ancient Greeks believed that your body had 4 different body humors that would affected your health. So when someone was sick and they figured, well, they must be out of balance, and so they'd take a lance and they would do bloodletting, and they would just, lose some blood over a certain amount of time until you were feeling better. And this is something that they did for thousands of years. In fact, even George Washington on his deathbed, his physician that was a common practice that he was administering to him at the time also. And so that has been several hundred years since we've been doing that sort of thing. But we look back at that and roll our eyes, but that was the common practice at the time. Another example, in the mid-1800s, there was a Hungarian physician named Semmelweis. He was working at a hospital, and he noticed that so many of the women in the maternity ward were dying of, they had fever, infection, and they were trying to figure out what was causing it. And he realized that a lot of the physicians that were working with them were also in a different section working on autopsies with these cadavers, and they would come straight over there without washing their hands or anything, and they'd work in the maternity ward and infect others. So they were actually serving as like these vectors of disease, these physicians that should have been helping them, because they didn't realize it then. And with time they found out if they would to sanitize and wash their hands and took preventative measures, that they would be able to decrease significantly the cases of infection and death that they were experiencing. And that's how we came about germ theory, which has obviously expanded since then. But now we can have a lot more respect for those things that we can't see, those microscopic germs, viruses, bacteria, things like that we were unfamiliar with before. We know that that can cause a lot of problems if we don't respect it and treat it properly. Another area is with mental health. If you look in the olden days when someone needed help within that area, they were basically deemed as crazy. They said, you're mad, and so they would send them to an insane asylum. How's that for politically correct back then? And those places in a lot of cases were nothing more than like a jail or a torture chamber for some people. Even until not that long ago, some of those facilities would do things like electric shock therapy. They would perform lobotomies where they'd take an ice pick and just carve around their frontal lobe in an attempt to remove negative characteristics or bad personality traits that were causing problems. So things like that, we look back now and think that was horrible. How can people be treated that way? But that was the norm at the time, and that's what people looked at for their care. Another area from the past that doesn't make a lot of sense is with smoking. If you look at any sort of like a movie from the 40s or 50s, all the Hollywood stars, those movies, they're lighting up throughout the whole movie, just chain smoking throughout the entire film. It was so glamorous back then. Even I remember the early 90s, I was on a plane flight in Paris, and as soon as the flight got airborne, half the passengers just lit up, and it was just, the cabin was just full of smoke. I couldn't breathe, my eyes were watering, and it just it makes you laugh that was such a normal thing. We used to have smoking and non-smoking in restaurants everywhere, but everyone was getting that secondhand smoke all the time, whether they wanted it or not. All right, and then in the late 80s, I remember when they revamped the food pyramid. They realized that Americans are getting too fat, so they're eating too much fat, we need to change their dietary habits. So they took fat on the food pyramid and put it up at the tippy top, and something you eat sparingly. And then they said, you need to eat more grains, more cereals, more pastas, more breads. And so people went crazy with that. That was the foundation of their nutrition. And lo and behold, a couple years into that, they realized, wow, people are more obese than they were before because they've been eating so many refined carbs. And then even since that time, they've adjusted and tweaked and modified the food pyramid. I think it's my plate now, but it's always changing. And so it's interesting how they didn't always get it right. Even more recently, we've seen the opioid crisis happening. I remember when I got my wisdom teeth out, it was a very painful experience, and that was my first introduction to Percocet. And man, that was nice. Also, I've had shoulder surgeries when I had Oxycontin prescribed, And after those times, I just remember I would take it, and within a few minutes, I would get warm, I'd get sweaty, I just feel so calm and happy, and it just made me feel so good taking it. And it scared me though, because after a couple of days, the pain went away, but I wanted to keep taking it. So every time I've had prescription drugs, painkiller, I always dump it after a little bit, just because I'm scared. I can see how easily that could happen. But as a result of prescribing giant portions of painkillers for people, way more than they need, there have been thousands of addicts and many deaths as a result of that. So that's a shame on the medical community for not being on top of that. But that's a big area where we can look back and think, what were they thinking, you know? And for my last example, we don't have to go back very far, but just think last year when the pandemic hit. I remember seeing some people wearing around masks right when it was starting. And I remember the CDC saying, you don't need to do that, that's overkill. You know, masks, that's for the medical professionals. Besides, those masks aren't even gonna filter out the viruses, they're so small. And then shortly later it says, yeah, you should wear a mask. A little bit later, they recommended, you know, actually mandatory to go a lot of places, you had to have a mask on. And then later after that, they said, yeah, 2 masks might even be good. And so it's just interesting to see how these changed. Also, a lot of the protocol for treatment, some of the methods they used really frowned upon and badmouthed by others, even though they were seeing good results by certain physicians. And so it's interesting. I know a lot of that could be political, financial reasons, whatever behind it. Anyway, I'm not trying to be controversial or be a conspiracy theorist, but it's just been interesting to see how things have changed and flip-flop and been arbitrary on the application of these rules across the board over the last couple of years. It makes a lot of people, makes it hard for them to really put their trust in the system and want to jump on board and do everything they're told.
We have top men working on it right now. Who? Top men.
So we'll always have top men telling us, making suggestions, telling us what we should do for our health, but it really is our responsibility. And so I encourage you to open your eyes, educate yourself, listen to your intuition, do whatever you feel is important to take better care of yourself. As you can see, some of these examples of you know, modern medicine and science, they haven't always been accurate, and sometimes they've been downright false. Some of these things we've believed in the past. I'm not trying to bash modern medicine or science or anything. I'm grateful for those, but a lot of times, just as our culture, the way we look at things, we just want someone else to take care of us, and we're just willing to follow and do whatever an expert says. So remember, the responsibility falls on your own shoulders for your health. So in about 10 years, it wouldn't surprise me if we look back and say, I can't believe we were doing whatever back in 2021, and we're just shaking our head at ourselves. History shows that's been the pattern over time, that we come to believe something, we're told something, we accept it as a society, as a culture, and then we're make course corrections later when we learn there's a better way of doing things, or that wasn't necessarily the case. Anyway, I hope you're enjoying these videos. If you hate it when people chew really loud with their mouth open with food, then feel free to like and subscribe to these videos, okay? We'll talk to you later.